Hey there, Gators! Welcome back for another awesome psychology video. Yay! This one is on learning theory, which I know we're all very excited about. Love me some learning theory. So we've got our student learning outcomes. When we talk about learning theory, now you got learning outcomes. And we have to get a definition. So that's what we typically start with. What is learning? So most of us, when we think about learning, we think about going to a classroom, somebody lecturing to us, taking notes, going home, studying them, regurgitating them, onto a test, learning. But learning is actually really super broad. So we've been learning our whole lives. It's any kind of change that we experience that results really from our experience. So the earliest experiences you had as an infant, you're flailing your arms around, you happen to get one close to your face, and you're like, hey, I like this. I'm going to eat this thumb. You've learned that if you flail around and you get that arm close to your face, you can eat a delicious thumb. Yummy. That's a good thing. You like it, so you're going to keep doing it. So that was something you learned very on. If I get that thumb in my mouth, it's a positive thing. So you've learned that as an infant. We keep learning as adults, learn throughout our entire life. This is very different, though, from just instincts or reflexes. So we're all born with a reflex to want to suck things that get close to our mouth. So it's called the rooting reflex. So if you put a nipple or a bottle close to the baby's mouth, they're going to come and put it in their mouth. They're going to root. So that is an instinct, or what we would call a reflex, which is very different than a learned behavior, something that you learn that you enjoy through experience with your environment. So even though it may look similar, it's different. So did you learn it, or was it something you're born with? So for humans, we don't talk much about instincts, but we might talk about instincts when we talk about things like fish that know to go back to their breeding grounds to have their own babies, or birds that fly for the winter. Those are instincts. They don't have to be taught that. They just know. They know that. So learning is different from these instincts. Associative learning is what we're going to spend our time talking about, and this occurs when we make connections between something, some kind of stimuli, some kind of event, and another one, both when they occur in the environment. So with classical conditioning, we're talking about events or stimuli that are unconscious. With operant conditioning, we're talking about conscious processes. And then with observational learning, it's more of watching and learning from others. So we'll break these three apart. That's what the whole lecture really is about getting an understanding of the classical, then operant, and then social learning theories. Classical conditioning was something that was derived from a person who's not even a psychologist, which was Ivan Pavlov. He was a physiologist. He studied dogs, and he studied their salivation, their digestion. So what he would do was feed the dogs and examine how much they salivated, or kind of that spit in their mouth. What he learned, though, was dogs didn't only salivate when they were presented with food, like here's your meat, puppy, and they have salivation. They also salivate when they see food, or when there's an empty food bowl brought to them, or even when they could hear him approaching. So they hear the footsteps, the dogs would salivate. So what he ended up doing was actually training dogs to salivate in response to things that weren't food. So normally they would not salivate to a bell. The bell would ring and they'd be like, oh, interesting. But they wouldn't salivate. But Pavlov trained them to do that. And this is how Pavlov did it. One of the big things with learning theory is not that the concepts are difficult conceptually, it's that we give them these terminology, these vocabulary words that make them more difficult. So this is especially what can trip people up, is this vocabulary. So just spend some time kind of making sure you understand these words. But we have things that are unconditioned. So what Pavlov started with were unconditioned stimuli and responses. They're unconditioned because they're unlearned. So not learned. There's something the dog already did. So the unconditioned stimulus, you showed them the meat or a meat powder, and they show a response to that meat powder. They would salivate. So you didn't have to teach that to the dog already knew it. So the meat powder made the dog salivate. In classical conditioning, what Pavlov did then was present a neutral stimulus, something the dog didn't care about, like a bell. The dog doesn't care about bells. So they present that neutral stimulus of the bell immediately before presenting the meat. So they would show ding, 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 meat, ding, 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 meat, ding, 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 meat. And after doing this over and over, the dog would salivate. So when Pavlov paired that meat powder with the tone over and over, this tone itself began to elicit that salivation. So that was something that was learned. So the neutral stimulus, the tone, becomes that conditioned stimulus. So the dog has learned, when I hear the bell, I'm going to get fed. So just hearing the bell, they start to salivate. So that salivation then is that conditioned response. So the dog had learned to associate the bell with being fed, and they therefore began to salivate when they heard that bell. So after enough pairings, then Pavlov is just able to go in there and ring a bell, and the dogs are like, oh, food is coming. So they'd start to salivate. So this seems really complicated. The terminology makes it sound complicated, but we've all had these experiences. So you just start to pair two things that occur in your environment simply because they occur frequently. This shows Pavlov's dog. So before conditioning, the dog would just salivate when the food was present, then would not salivate to the bell, didn't give any care to that bell at all. And then during conditioning, the meat and the bell were paired over and over. You know, here's the bell tone, here's your meat, here's the bell tone, here's your meat, here's the bell tone, over and over. And then after conditioning, it was enough to just ring that bell tone and the dog would salivate. So I've got some examples and some non-dog related examples as well posted in some of those video clips below. So what I want you to think now is kind of after going through this process, think about how you could hypothetically make someone tear up by showing them a common ink pen. I'm a bad student here, I didn't bring my ink pen, but we'll use this device here, this popsicle. So how could I just make you cry by showing you this? So you can pause the video and think about this for a minute, but one way you might be able to do it is I show you this and punch. Show you the lollipop or the pen and punch ya. Show it to you and punch ya. Show it to you and punch ya. Do this over and over and over again, the pairing. So eventually then I just lift this up and you know you're going to get punched and you start to cry. So there'd be many ways then just repeatedly pairing some kind of negative stimulus with that pen or that popsicle then makes the person cry or get upset when you show them that item. So another kind of aspect of classical conditioning is higher order conditioning. So we can pair a new neutral stimulus with that already learned conditioned stimulus. We typically will only do this for one level, a higher order conditioning. We will not learn third order or any higher associations. So if you've got this kitty cat who's learned that the can opener is an indication that the food's coming, they might salivate to the can opener. But then they learn that the can opener is actually held within a squeaky cabinet door. So now instead of just waiting for that can opener, as soon as the door itself opens, which means you're getting the can opener, which means they're going to get fed, they might start salivating at the sound of that closet door opening. So they've learned not only just one association, but multiple associations. An example of this in the human realm might be buying formula. So you can kind of think through this problem. So if Sarah she purchases the same kind of formula for her daughter, eventually her daughter Angelina is going to get excited about seeing the formula, and you can think through what are unconditioned parts of this response, or the stimulus. What's the unconditioned stimulus? It didn't have to teach her anything. What did Angelina do in response to that unconditioned stimulus? And then what's been conditioned in Angelina? So you can spend some time kind of thinking through that problem. This is just a cute comic about classical conditioning, Pavlovian Christmas. They ring the bell and all the dogs are salivating. Timing is important when it comes to classical conditioning. So you want this learning or this acquisition period to occur within this brief period of time. So if Pavlov rang the bell and then eventually brought the meat, it really wouldn't be a strong association. It has to be paired within a brief interval. So bell, meat, bell, meat, bell, meat consistently. One type of learning that doesn't seem to follow this pattern, though, is taste aversion learning. With taste aversion learning, you can eat something and then hours later you can get sick, and it doesn't even have to be related to the food or the drink that you consumed. It can be just, you eat something and then you just get the flu a few hours later and you vomit that back up. And then you can develop this aversion where just seeing it makes you sick. And for me, I've got mine on there as Fig Newtons. So I ate through a whole sleeve of Fig Newtons, which was probably just a bad idea in life. And then I ended up getting like the stomach flu and regurgitated all of my Fig Newtons. And now if somebody eats them in front of me or even like look at them, they make me sick. Like I don't even like looking at the slide head on because I don't like seeing these Fig Newtons. So it just makes me sick. And we think this may have to do with evolution. So if you ate something and it made you sick, then you don't want to eat it anymore. If you find a spider out there and you're like, delicious, and then you vomit, you might not want to go around eating spiders. So it might help to keep us alive. Although I'm sure I wouldn't die if I ate a Fig Newton. But, Extinction is something that's also important for understanding with classical conditioning, and this is when we stop really making that paired association. So if Pavlov just came up and rang that bell forever in the dog's face but didn't feed it, eventually the bell would be useless or meaningless. It didn't signal food anymore. So the dog would not salivate to the sound of the bell. So you have to keep making that pairing or we're going to see extinction. After a little bit of time, though, if Pavlov did have this extinction process occur, if he came back then a few hours later and rang the bell, we're going to see a bit of a spontaneous recovery where the dog might salivate a little bit. Like, oh, am I going to get fed this time? Or are we doing that again? But then if they didn't get fed quickly, then they would just continue with the extinction. So it's almost like they get hopeful, like, hey, you want to feed me something? Oh, okay. And then they give it back up. Our stimulus can either become can become discriminated or generalized. So with discrimination, this is when that dog will learn to respond differently to similar stimuli. So, the dog will learn only the bell means I'm getting fed, not a jaunty tune or, the sound of things clinking around in the dishwasher. Like, none of that means I'm getting fed. Only the bell means I'm getting fed. So they learn to discriminate between similar stimuli. Only the bell means I'm getting fed. In contrast, so the complete opposite of that is that they can generalize. And with this, the organism learns to generalize from that clinking bell sound to other similar stimuli. So then they might learn that a ringtone, a little jaunty tune means they're going to get fed. It really just depends on what that environment looks like for them. So if they do get fed with things that are similar to that bell, then they're going to generalize. If it's only that bell that ever means you're going to get fed, they're going to discriminate. So it really depends on how you play that in the environment. Habituation is something we see in all creatures. We see this in babies. So we just eventually stop responding to a stimulus if it doesn't change, which is great for us because, like right now, I have a shirt that's on my body, but I don't pay attention to this shirt because it hasn't changed. So my brain is not just telling me, you're wearing a shirt, you're wearing a shirt, you're wearing a shirt, you're wearing a shirt, there's a shirt. That would be very irritating. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't talk about psychology. All I'd be thinking about is the fact that I'm wearing a shirt. But thankfully, because it's a present, constant stimulus, my brain stops registering it. So that's what it'll do, habituation. So if somebody just keeps talking to you and you're tired of hearing it, eventually you'll just habituate. Won't pay a lick of attention to it. So that brings us into behaviorism as a field. So behaviorism is super, super interesting. We're going to talk about a few of the big behaviorists. We've already talked about Ivan Pavlov, who we kind of call behaviorist, even though he's a physiologist. But John Watson is our real founder of behaviorism. So he brought in some of Pavlov's work. He thought all behavior was the stimulus response, and he thought that psychology should focus only on behavior. This kind of tells you a little bit about the man John Watson was. So we've mentioned his quote before, but he thought really that he could take a dozen babies and bring them up to be anything he wanted them to be. So he thought that was nurture ruled everything. Your nature is nothing. So an experiment he did to try to understand conditioning is he worked with a graduate student to condition a baby. So what he did with this baby, all of this text really just tells us this process. But initially they had Albert, this baby, and they showed him a rabbit. So Albert didn't care about this rabbit. He might have thought it was cute, played with it a little bit, but wasn't super concerned. But then they went through this process where Albert showed him the rabbit and made a horrible loud noise. So he had the rabbit, loud noise, or the rat, loud noise, rat, loud noise, rat, loud noise. Yeah, I always think it's this rabbit, but it's a rat, a little white rat. But he made this, connection between this rat and this loud noise over and over and over and over. And eventually Albert then became afraid of that white fuzzy creature. So he could just show him the rat and Albert would cry. So he had learned to fear that animal. And this generalized. So he was afraid of rabbits. He was afraid of Santa Claus masks. He was afraid of fuzzy things. He was afraid of fur, any type of fur coat or outfit. So he was afraid of so many different things because of this process where John Watson paired that loud noise with that animal repeatedly. So he conditioned fear. We would not do this anymore. And, if you're like, oh, that sounds terrible. Yeah, your moral compass is on point there. It is terrible. And especially because we have no evidence that he ever unconditioned this fear. He just let him be afraid forever. So we would consider that to be unethical. This is what John Watson did after his university career. So Watson actually resigned in a lot of scandal. He had an affair with that graduate student that he did the work with, Rosalie Rayner, and ended up working in advertising. So what he realized is you could pair an attractive model with a product, and after repeated pairing of that attractive model and that product, we would associate the product with attractiveness and beauty and sexuality. So that's why you end up having now models paired with cigarettes or with cars, or even Paris Hilton eating a cheeseburger from Carl's Jr. while in a bathing suit, because it's trying to pair that sex with the product. So thanks, John Watson, for that one. That brings us out of classical conditioning, though, and we'll spend some time talking about operant conditioning. So I think operant conditioning is actually a lot easier to understand for most people. It has more to do with your voluntary behaviors. Some of the terminology is a little easier. But really with operant, what we're talking about is we learn to associate a behavior and whatever the consequence of that behavior is. So we learn to associate this through reinforcement and punishment. So B.F. Skinner is someone... PowerPoint working. There we go. B.F. Skinner is a psychologist then who saw that believed that classical conditioning really wouldn't help us to develop a lot of new behaviors, so he was interested in operant conditioning. And he based this on the law of effect from another researcher named Thorndike. And what Thorndike found is he locked cats in a box and found that the cats, if something actually helped them get out of the box, they repeated it. If it didn't help them out of the box, they stopped it. So if it was a good thing, if it got you pleasure, you did it again. If it got you nothing, you stopped doing it, which makes sense, I think, for most of us. We can see how that works. So B.F. Skinner took that information and ran with it and made what we call Skinner boxes. So he did work with animals, mostly rats and pigeons, and really wanted to understand how he could train them through this process of rewarding them or punishing them for behavior. So he put these rats, you can see them there in the Skinner box. They'll press a lever and they'll get a reward, or they'll press a lever and they'll get a shock, which is a punishment. And so he could shape their behavior very, very well by using this process. So in this paradigm, we're going to talk about some theory or some vocabulary words, but an important thing here is that people often think just positive and negative mean good and bad. That's the case for many areas of your life, but it's not the case in psychology. So what we're talking about here are positive and negative reinforcement and punishment, but with positive, we're just talking about adding something. So you can add something that we don't want. Like I could give you a positive punishment by slapping you or punching. You don't want that, but it means I'm adding something to you. I'm adding a punch, adding a kick. So positive means add, negative means take something away. So with negative punishment then, I'll take away a cell phone. So I take away something to punish your behavior. So positive you're adding, negative you're subtracting. And then reinforcement always means you're trying to increase whatever that behavior is. Punishment means you're trying to decrease it. So we can put this in a quadrant then to kind of understand, positive reinforcement and positive punishment, negative reinforcement and negative punishment. So if it's positive, I'm adding. If it's negative, I'm taking it away. Reinforcement, I want you to continue that behavior. Punishment, I want you to stop the behavior. So reinforcement, the most effective way to teach a behavior is positive reinforcement, by far. So this is when you give somebody something to increase the behavior. So if I want you to study harder and I give you a gold star on the top of your paper, then I'm trying to get you to do the behavior more by giving you something. Negative reinforcement is also something that can increase behavior. So negative reinforcement is what often confuses people. But if you think about those cars where it makes a noise until you buckle up, so you might be driving down the road and it's just like beep, 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 beep in your face and you're frustrated by it. So what it's trying to do is to get you to perform a behavior it wants you to do, buckle up, by taking away then that nasty noise you don't like to hear. So it takes something away to get you to increase your buckling behavior. Punishment always decreases behavior. So when it's positive, you're adding something, like the kick or the punch or the slap, or extra chores. Now you have to do all of the dishes instead of just once a week. Or negative punishment, you're trying to decrease the behavior by removing a pleasant stimulus. So I'm going to take something away from you to punish that behavior. I'm going to take away your car keys, your cell phone. I'm going to modify those things so you don't have them. Punishment, though, has to be immediate. So if there's this long, lingering window between the two, we don't learn. That's why they'll say if you're gone all day and your dog soils the house, then don't get mad at him when you get home because he doesn't understand what the heck that was 6 hours ago. So it needs to be immediate. It can teach fear. So especially, with the spanking, smacking kinds of things, it can breed fear, and it can cause kids to become more aggressive. So most of the time, then psychologists really rely on and recommend positive reinforcement whenever possible. So you would reinforce a behavior that's incompatible with that behavior you don't like. So it's not saying if you see a child smack their sibling that you say, "Good job, little Johnny, good job smacking that sibling." No, we don't want to say that. But instead, we would reinforce any type of good behavior we saw. So if we saw little Johnny even walk by his sibling without attacking him, then we might say, "Thank you, little Johnny, for walking past your sibling in such a nice manner and keeping your hands to yourself." So we wouldn't reinforce the bad behavior. We would just look for something good that we could reinforce. Shaping. Shaping is interesting. We can see this when we look at behavior such as dolphins going through a hoop. So if you just hold a hoop up high, a dolphin's never just going to go right through it. It would be very unlikely. So it's extremely unlikely they're going to display that behavior spontaneously. So what we want to do then is reinforce any response that resembles it, that gets close to it, that's anywhere near what we want. So even if you swim closer to me, I'll reinforce that response. And then reinforce those ones that more closely, come close to that behavior that we want to see, and then continue that process, and then finally only reinforce when they do the full process. So in the first earliest levels of training, you might reinforce for every inch that dolphin gets closer to you. As the training goes on, you only reinforce for when it makes an actual jump into the hoop. So that'd be the final step. Reinforcers really have to have personal meaning to the individual. So primary ones, though, we're all pretty motivated by. So this is things like water, food, sleep, sex. We're all motivated by those things. Secondary reinforcers only have power for us when they're paired with the primary reinforcer. So that's things like praise and money. Money is just paper. It really means nothing. It's only when we associate it with our water, our food, our sleep that it becomes something of meaning. So behavior modification is a way we would apply these principles then. So we'd use these principles of operant conditioning to help people change their behavior. In order to do that, we really have to have that personally relevant reinforcement. So we need to know what you'll work for. We need to give you that reward consistently, and it needs to be connected in some way to your behavior. So if you use the toilet correctly, you'll get a little popsicle, and we give it to you because you like it, and you'll get it every time. But then, of course, we can't keep giving popsicles to someone when they're 32 because they use the toilet. So we will have to modify this eventually. Timeout is a negative punishment, so it's taking you away from something in order to decrease the behavior. General rule for that's about a minute per age. The reinforcement schedule. So I just mentioned we can't keep giving a 32-year-old a popsicle every time they use the toilet. So when we have a little guy, a 2-year-old, then we would use continuous reinforcement. Every time you try to sit on that toilet, you get a popsicle. But eventually, we're going to move that kid down to partial reinforcement. So we're only going to reinforce that, every couple times that he sits on the toilet. And then after that, we're going to, go to extinction. So you don't get that popsicle anymore. You just get praise, and then eventually it just becomes a learned behavior. Some schedules of reinforcement. If there's a fixed schedule, this means the number of responses between this reinforcement and what you'll receive for it is unchanging. If it's variable, you can get the reinforcement at different times. And then interval, it's based on time, and ratio, it's based on number of responses. So with interval, if we had a rat who was trained to press a lever, and they would get a piece of corn every 5 times they pressed, then we'd be on a ratio schedule. It'd be every number of responses, and it would be fixed. So it's unset and unchanging. Every 5 times you hit it, you get something. So we would say it's a partial reinforcement schedule that's fixed and is on a ratio schedule. This will go over some of that, where we see these types of schedules like fixed interval, fixed ratio, etc. So you can kind of see those there. Things like gambling or variable ratio, which is one reason they can be so addicting. We keep thinking, maybe next time, maybe next time. Latent learning is something that strict behaviorists didn't really believe in, but Tolman thought, we do have this cognitive piece, and he found that rats can learn a maze even though they're not being reinforced. And he found this by having them explore the maze and make these cognitive maps and learn the maze, but then they weren't really motivated to do anything with that information until food was provided. Once the food was provided, the rats made their way through quickly. So they were learning, they just weren't motivated to show the behavior. So the latent learning then is that learning that occurs, and it's just not observable until there's some reason to motivate me. And that brings us into observational learning. So we're almost done with learning theory. Observational learning is really quite simple compared to the other two. What we're doing is we're watching people and we're imitating them. So they provide a model for us of the appropriate things we want to do, and we watch them, and then we perform that behavior. So we might be wired to do this. There's some thought that we're wired to do this through a specific type of neuron called a mirror neuron, which would activate not only when I do something, but also when you do it and I watch you do it. Then we might see that mirror neuron activating. So it's almost like we're wired to learn from each other's behavior. Bandura was someone who did this early research, so he thought these internal states have to have a role in our learning. And he said there's many ways we can get through this learning, so we can learn the response by watching other people. We make an active choice whether or not we want to imitate them. So if someone, if we watch somebody go up and, give a little slap to a bull, think about that. So they go and they slap the bull. We would watch them do this, and we might think, maybe I'll go slap the bull on the behind too. But if the bull turns around and charges them, then we're like, no, thank you, sir. I'm not going to slap that bull. Or if a bunch of people laugh, then that's a positive thing. We might think, hey, I want people to laugh at me too. I'm going to go up and give a little smack. So, we would choose whether or not we're going to engage, and we can learn this general rule that we can apply to other situations. We can see a behavior in person. We can have somebody explain a behavior to us, or we can have somebody kind of in a symbolic role who teaches this behavior, often in the media. So steps that, how we actually do through this or go through this, we have to focus on what the model's doing. So I would watch you approach the bull. I'd remember what I observed from watching you. I would be able to perform that behavior myself, and then I'd have some motivation to do it. So again, if you were reinforced, if people laughed at you for giving that tap, then I might do it myself. But if the bull turned around and charged you, or you got scared, or you got screamed at by your mom, then I'm not going to want to do that. So that's vicarious punishment. I don't want to do that. So I would make that choice. Bandura learned about this by using a Bobo doll study. So he would have kids watch adults interact with this Bobo doll, which was a clown model that was, like the picture shows, one you could punch and it comes back and forth and back and forth. So he had children watch adults engage with this Bobo doll. And the modeling, children did model this behavior. So when they were given the opportunity to play with that clown, they would also, show those same kind of unique modeling behaviors, like sitting on top of it, pummeling it, threatening it. So the children would model that behavior. But if the teacher was punished, if the adult was punished for doing that behavior, children really were not likely to model. If the teacher was praised, or if nobody said anything, then children did model. So pretty much if we know we're going to get in trouble for something, we watch somebody else get in trouble, then we don't do it. That's pretty much it. And so this can help us in many ways. So we can have pro-social models. So if you've got kids who are doing a great thing, and we show that to other kids, and we're like, hey, look how amazing this kid is, then they might want to model that behavior. But we can also have negative models. And we know this by looking at the cycle of violence. So unfortunately, many kids who are experiencing abuse then will go on to abuse. By far not everyone. Many people make that choice not to abuse. But for a lot of us, we do what we know. And so we model those people around us, whether we want to or are not really thinking about it. And this can have a big role in the media as well. So this is something psychologists are definitely concerned about, is this link between viewing violence and aggression. We see a lot of violent acts on the media, and this repeated exposure may desensitize us to it, makes it seem not as impactful as it might otherwise be. So we learn from many different things in our environment. We learn in different ways. And we're finally finished talking about learning. Thank you, Gators.